Let's continue the debate on the home demolition policy with my next guest. In the studio with me is Middle East analyst Shai Franklin, and joining us from Philadelphia is Middle East Forum Director Gregg. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. Shai, these home demolition policies, they're essentially a way to counter the financial incentive that the Palestinian leaders give to the terrorists and or their families. The more Israelis that the terrorists kill, the higher the financial reward that they receive if they're still alive or their family receives if they're dead. So this is the way of sending a message that, no, your family will not benefit from your actions. Do you think that it's effective, though?
Well, the home demolitions originated about almost 30 years ago. So the whole financial incentive issue, I don't think, is part of the premise of the home demolitions.
Well, it is now.
It's one of the excuses. I think it gives people a feeling of Israelis a feeling of justice, and it gives Israeli politicians a way to appease a particular constituency, particularly at a time like this week when Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to shore up his right-wing base to be confirmed as permanent Minister of Defense.
So, Gregg, is it an effective policy, or does it, as some argue, just stoke further resentment for Israelis and channels that, and Hamas can then effectively channel that anger?
So the actual home demolitions began not 30 years ago, but back during the British Mandate after they took over from the Ottoman Empire in 1918 and 1919. So it's been a policy that's been in effect, or at least has been allowed, for over 100 years. Beyond that, we have a study that came out of Northwestern and Hebrew University 4 years ago, which showed in the aggregate, home demolitions led to a decrease in suicide attacks and violence by an aggregate between 12 and 15% in each district that was surveyed between home demolitions that took place between 2000 and 2005, when the Israeli government temporarily suspended the process, only to reactivate it in 2014. In the net, what we see is that when a home is demolished, the homes that are affected by that area around it and the individuals and the families and the clans and the tribes and the district governates encourage their citizens to participate in attacks against Israelis less. So if the question is this a deterrent that is factually proven by a study by 2 universities, one in Israel and one outside, the answer is yes.
Right. And, you know, some make the argument, Shai, that Israel isn't going far enough for these home demolitions. This particular one for the Barkan killer, as he's known, only demolished part of the house and the family of one of the victims, saying that it should be a complete and total demolition. I mean, they're saying that this kind of response is, in fact, a joke. They make the case that just like a family member has been completely ripped from their family and the family at large suffers, so too should the terrorists' family suffer. They want more action.
Well, that's one way to approach it. That is called collective punishment, and internationally, that's considered illegal. By the way, the British Mandate law that Israel invokes goes back to 1945, I think, but Israel only began using that, I think, in the early 90s. They suspended it in 2005 because the IDF's own study found that it was not effective. And in fact, they were concerned that it would be counterproductive in terms of getting not only the family members, but other people to become more aggrieved. And then it ends up recruiting more terrorists. So
conflicting statistics, it sounds like, from what you bring to the table and what Gregg brings to the table. I'm
going to trust what the IDF itself says.
Gregg, what's your response to that?
So the IDF was having that policy when they were trying to get out of Gaza, and they were trying to basically remove themselves in a strategic decision of separating themselves from the Palestinians. The logic that was behind that was flawed logic, because what we saw after there was a de-escalation in the contact between Israelis and Palestinians was that it gave Palestinians more time to plan more egregious attacks. This is why we have Hamas in control of Gaza right now. It's why we have a steady security situation in intra-Palestinian security, but an unstable situation that's going on right now, as we saw with the last 3 or 4 attacks, where a baby died and we had 2 soldiers massacred on the side of a street. And actually, if you look at the recent incident that took place, and I think it was November of last year, when a house was demolished, and then there was another terrorist that was trying to preeminate his own attack there, we saw his family stopped him and turned him into the Palestinian security forces. The reason why? The father didn't want his home to be taken out. So I'm going to leave justice and moral issues on the side and try to equivocate this between one issue where there's more attacks happening when there's not demolitions, and less attacks happening when there is demolitions. And if I have to take the side of protecting civilians by a terrorist who I think is a rational actor when it comes to him thinking of his family, I'm going to say you better demolish that house as a preventative measure rather than having one where you're going to have more attacks, because a terrorist can do whatever he wants because he knows that everyone around him is going to be safe and is going to have financial gain.
I want the IDF to do what it takes to stop civilians from being killed.
So what is
and I don't appreciate the implication that I don't.
Okay, so in your opinion, how should Israel then respond to terrorist attacks?
I think the IDF should figure out what it needs to do strategically. And I think the study that was done 13 years ago by the IDF was not for political purposes. It was the IDF professionals figuring out, is this effective? Is it not effective? If for political reasons Israel chooses to do something, that's the choice of the decision makers.
Given the culture, the way that a terrorist is celebrated as a martyr in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere, wouldn't it be worse if Israel didn't respond in some way?
The response doesn't have to be necessarily demolishing a home. There are other ways to respond. One way to respond might be not negotiating with Hamas, which is far more violent than the PA, including in the West Bank, not allowing Qatari cash to come into Gaza for Hamas, and in fact trying to shore up the less violent wing of the Palestinian Authority, which we call Fatah or Mahmoud Abbas.
Which also financially rewards terrorists.
Yes, but not the way that Hamas does.
So
Hamas actually drives them.
But the Palestinian Authority does, and Greg, I'll let you continue this sentiment.
The PA also cooperates with the Israelis on security.
They do cooperate with Israelis, but at the same time, they do give money to terrorists and their families, Greg.
No, 27% of the PA budget goes to pay for terror attacks. So while they might be able to speak in English and smile in front of cameras when they're meeting with their Israeli counterparts to discuss economic arrangements, which fills their coffers, to discuss tax arrangements, which makes them richer and allow them to drive Jaguars and Mercedes and BMWs around Ramallah, when it comes to the tacit approval of these attacks from cradle to grave instances of Palestinian incitement, the PA is full-throatedly supporting these attacks. More than that, they're celebrating them on their own social media accounts. So I agree with you. The Israelis should not be negotiating with the Hamas in Gaza. They should not be allowing troves of Qatari cash going in, and they should be commencing housing demolitions against the homes of terrorists who decide to put their lives on the line to kill Israeli civilians. The issue is not mutually exclusive, as you make it try to come out to be. And more than that, I think that if you have the full suite of measures that you can do, there are other actions that abide by international law and abide by collective humanitarian convention that allow Israel to increase their deterrent capability while at the same time implementing the decisions that you're saying. It's not saying this or that. Let's use all measures at our disposal, including demolishing homes of terrorists who are trying to kill young Israelis.
All right, we're going to have to give you the final word there, Greg. We're out of time. Greg, thank you so much. Gregg Roman, Shai Franklin.